So I'm John Jensen. I'm a senior licensing manager at Partners Healthcare. I specifically focus on Mass General Hospital and the departments of anesthesia, urology, and OBGYN. I have a background in mechanical engineering, been doing this type of job for about 10 years. Prior to coming to Partners, I was at Boston University for about 8 years, managing the technology that came out of the engineering school there. So today we're talking about commercialization strategies. Specifically, do we license to an existing company, or do we form a new company, right? And this is really this is what Seema and I do on a daily basis, right? We work with smart people like yourselves who invent new things. We protect that intellectual property, and we try to move it into a company in some form so that they can bring a product to market to help people and patients. So we're going to talk about a number of different questions, some big questions that we're going to hit over the course of the presentation. First of all, what is the problem that we're solving, and what is our value proposition, right? So we have a problem that we're solving. Hopefully the technology is a solution to that problem, and what is the value that solution is bringing. How do the technology type, so sort of the market or domain, and also the state of development of that technology influence strategy? And then what is the strategy? So using that information, how do we formulate a strategy? And then how do we find suitable partners for that technology, those people who can bring it to market, since most of the time the institutions that we're working in don't bring products to market themselves. We need to rely on partners to do that. And then, as Cheryl mentioned at the end, we're going to sort of run through kind of a workshop case study to try to put some of this stuff that we're discussing into action. So first of all, the value proposition. So let's assume we have a discovery and it solves a problem. How do we determine the value that solution's bringing? And really the value that solution is bringing is dependent upon its incremental benefits over what's already out there. And so usually the first three questions I ask are, what is the problem? What's the solution? Hopefully that's your discovery technology. And how is it better, faster, or cheaper than what's currently being done out there? And you all have the notes to these slides that kind of give a list of some of these examples. So better, that could be more efficacious. It's a better standard of care. It could be less toxic. It could also be easier. That's another sort of version of better in terms of maybe it's easier to comply with the treatment, easier to take, easier information to digest. Faster, that could mean the patient gets better faster. Maybe you have results or information. If it's a diagnostic, maybe you have those results. You get that information faster and can act on it faster. And then cheaper. Cheaper is fairly self-explanatory, but it could mean cheaper to the customer, right? It could be cheaper to produce, and that's that's essentially cheaper. So let's talk about an example value proposition. So colon cancer research. Let's assume the state of the art here is colonoscopy and biopsy. And the discovery that we have is this potential diagnostic here where we have 51 serum proteins that are overexpressed in a mouse model, human homologs confirmed, and all are known serum proteins. So the question here is, what is the value of this discovery? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Some kind of diagnostic.
Right. So that would be, that's sort of the solution, right? That's the discovery. How is it better, faster, or cheaper?
In this particular case may not be, but in terms of diagnosis, if immediately assay is available, it could, allow the sample to be tested, patient confirm whether he has cancer or not cancer. Right.
Okay, so maybe a result of having, let's say, a blood diagnostic for something like this is that it's better in terms of maybe it's less invasive. That could be That could be one option. Maybe this could also be faster, actually. Maybe it's also, it takes time to do the procedure, and the blood test could be faster. Also, this could be better predictive than existing markers. Right, yeah, exactly. And then maybe, so sometimes you have one or you have all of them or a combination of them. So you could, it's very possible that this test could result in faster diagnosis, more specific diagnosis or more accurate diagnosis. So I like where this activity was placed in the presentation, because a few of you sort of foreshadowed kind of the next piece of what we're going to talk about here, which is, there's kind of two aspects to this analysis. You kind of look internally at what you have, the technology that you've invented. What do I have? And then you sort of look externally and you say, who wants this, right? Who's willing to purchase this? And so that's the market piece. So we've kind of thought through how do we analyze what our value proposition is. The next step is really to look at the market, right? So who wants this solution now? Who's the customer that just has such a pent-up need for this that they'll say, if you said what if I could give you this solution now? They would say I'd place an order for 1 million of them or whatever. They'd hand you the money in their pocket, or the insurer would hand you the money in their pocket in order to get that solution. And so characterizing who that person is and sort of how big that market is of course a big step in working up towards the ultimate commercialization strategy. So the first step in that is identifying who that person is, who that patient is, who the customer is, who the end user is, which is sometimes different than the customer. And thinking about how the discovery you have will be delivered to that customer, right? And so sometimes it's obvious, but in many cases it's less obvious. So I have this science, this great discovery. What will the package look like that is ultimately delivered to that customer, right? So is it a pill in the bottle? Is it some sort of a service maybe? Is it this just one component to an overall solution, or is it more of like a standalone solution? And then something that's often just as important in developing countries, for instance, is how does that solution get to the customer? How is it being delivered? And what are the mechanisms involved in doing that? So once we've kind of characterized that, once we understand who the players are and have kind of set the stage, then we can spend time researching that, right? We can figure out who the players are, do some market research. So I like to think of market research as kind of two sort of sources for that. One is your static market research, Google, market research reports and things like that. The place, though, where I think you can get the most benefit, the most bang for your buck, if you will, is in talking to key opinion leaders or domain experts, right? And so, once you understand sort of what that product looks like and who the customer looks like, then you can spend some time kind of socializing your idea, meeting people who are in that space, leveraging your network, LinkedIn and things like that to talk to people. Obviously the first question that comes to mind is how big is that market? Again, sometimes that's obvious depending upon the type of technology. You don't really have to do a whole lot of research if you have a diabetes therapeutic or a cancer therapeutic or something like that. Maybe there's less market risk there. But in other instances, maybe you do. Maybe it's an orphan population, or maybe it's not clear what the addressable market is within that big. You first have this big number, right, which is kind of the total market, and then you sort of try to peel the onion, as they say, and look at what the addressable market is in there. In your example, you had 80% who
potentially could benefit.
Right. And so you might have a bigger number. It's much more precise and less naive to say, okay, well, it's not that bigger number, but there's 80% within this big number that are the people who we're targeting, and these are the reasons why. And so, there are other aspects to that. So maybe you have a sense for what ballpark you're playing in terms of how big is the overall market and what's the addressable market inside of there. And then, of course, that can be sort of affected by whether it's kind of a new market, whether it's growing, how crowded the market is, things like that. And then in doing this kind of research, one of the things that I like to sort of challenge myself and other people with is, I think our nature is sort of to look for information that validates our idea, that sort of supports our idea and reinforces our idea. I think another approach that can be helpful is to go out looking for things that might kill it, that could be kind of critical failures, right? And so what would get in the way? I mean, I tend to be an optimistic person, right? But I think it's important to understand what the weaknesses are and go seek those out so that you can understand and kind of quantify the level of those risks to commercialization. And so examples of those kinds of risks or barriers to adoption would be related products in use. So said another way, competition. Who is your competition? How crowded is that space? Obviously, there's regulatory concerns, so understanding that pathway and understanding, what path you'll have to go and sort of what the risks are associated with that are important. Ease of implementation, does this disrupt an existing workflow? Would there be a lot of training associated with this, with the new product? You have to convince decision makers, so maybe you have some strong scientific data, but for whatever reason, maybe that goes against accepted practices within the industry and entrenched players. And then, of course, blocking IP, right? So we want to get our own IP estate, but there could be other people who have IP out there, and that IP could be blocking us in certain ways. And so this is just a little example. I mean, we don't really have to go through this in detail, but there can be instances where you may have some sort of value proposition, and it may not be clear that that value proposition is really enough to kind of unseat existing players or the existing solution, right? So, is your incremental benefit enough to really justify the investment that's going to go into bringing a completely new solution to market, right? So maybe you have something that's better, maybe it's a lot better. Maybe you have an imaging solution that's resolution is 100 times greater, but what the market has for that application is already sufficient, and they're really just looking for cost reductions. And so, in that case, it's great technology, great science, but maybe that's not the right market or the right application for the technology. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Seema here.
I'm Seema Basu. I work with John, and I'll pick it up from here and walk you down the path of commercialization. So we'll do it in two pieces. One is think about the technology as the type of technology, what stage it is at, so you can understand for different types of technology what is the path to market. And then think about the licensing strategy and what are the tactics to get that partnered and licensed. Okay, so when you think of your technology, you think of it from a marketplace, whether it's a therapeutic, so a pharmaceutical, is it a medical device or a diagnostic? And then you try to think, as you're defining a value proposition and you're thinking about partnering it, what stage are you at for that technology? So for a therapeutic, when you're thinking about stage, typical questions are, have you identified a pathway? Have you identified the target? Is your target validated? Do you know mechanism of action, how it works, like you drew on the board? Do you have any potential drug candidates, an antibody, small molecules, right? If it's a medical device, a good stage check is, do you have a rough working prototype? Have you shown it in an animal model? It depends on the device. And for diagnostic, what's your validation data look like? Is it from in vitro experiments in cell lines? Is it in an animal model? Or do you have the information from patient data? And all these factors, understanding whether your technology is a pharmaceutical, is a medical device, is a diagnostic, what stage it is, influences how you're going to partner, with whom you're going to partner, how easy is it going to be, partner, and what's the value proposition that you're bringing to the table to that partner. So let's think about simple timeline and cost for each of these categories. So therapeutics, we all know, is something that takes over 15 years and close to $1 billion. Medical device, it depends on the class of device, and so there's a huge range. It's roughly 5 to 10 years and could range from $10 to $30 million. Again, depending on whether you're going through a device that needs PMA, if it's a therapeutic device or not. Diagnostic, again, it depends because of the range of diagnostic technologies, and they are 1 to 5 years, and then again can range from as little as $1 million to $30 million. So these are just historically categories to give you a sense for what the path to market looks like for the partner that's going to take on your technology. So let's go a little deeper dive into therapeutic, right? So if you think from value proposition or de-risking, value inflection points for a therapeutic, at the minimal that you have some animal data. What's really nice is if you are a few years away to an IND. So if you are a partner and you're doing a value proposition and trying to bring to the table, the partner's weighing the time to market. If you are a existing pharmaceutical company for a therapeutic, you know it's 10 to 12 years of, to get it to market. If you're a small startup company thinking what's your inflection point at where you will exit, minimum 5 years you're looking at. Same if you are a small startup company, you're thinking your exit is going to require, if you're going to raise money, close to $100 million if you want to get to an inflection point and exit. And typically for therapeutics, the ones that are blockbusters, you want large market size. That gets you your most value inflection value proposition. What are the biggest risks for therapeutic? Clinical trials. What kind of therapeutic is it? What's the design of trial going to be? How much is it going to cost? Is it a longitudinal study that's going to take a long time? Are there even good endpoints? How will FDA view it? So regulatory and clinical trial is the biggest challenge for therapeutics from a value proposition. About still 50% drugs fail at phase 3. You know, it's an expensive proposition. So let's think about devices. Value inflection point for device, again, very dependent on the device, but a working prototype, some evidence that the device works in an animal model, or depending on the device, if there's technical and user data, that would help. Again, when you're balancing risk and value proposition here, so if you're an existing company, you know you're going to spend, depending on the device, 2 to 5 years to get to market. If you're a startup company, typical models are trying to get to revenue before you exit. And for a startup company, exits are you either go IPO or you get purchased by a company, larger company. So the risk for a device is, as John pointed out, adoption. And also because a lot of times, even though you don't need full clinical trial maybe for the device, you still need to show some clinical data to convince adoption, clinicians who will have to use the device. You need to have something to bring quick adoption. The other big challenge is reimbursement. If you have to get a new code for that device, it's after regulatory approval and can take almost 2 years to do that. And that leads to slower adoption, because if it's not going to be reimbursed, there's going to be less adoption, and there comes competition, and you've reduced your success rate. So for diagnostic, again, the value inflection point is some prospective data and analysis from patient samples. So balancing that, time to market can vary from 2 to 8 years. The investment is somewhat in between, though currently FDA regulation is becoming very high for diagnostics, and it's becoming challenging. And the risk, again, are reimbursement and adoption, because in diagnostic, really, you have to ask, Is it going to change decision making by the clinician? Is it going by your doctor? Is it going to change how therapy is administered? Is it really neat to have or nice to have in terms of reimbursement and adoption? Okay. So that's when you're thinking from what type of technology you have, what's the path to market look like. So when you've synthesized all this, you're trying to, as an academic technology, I'll go with the typical case. We're typically early stage technologies, and we're not quite de-risked. So one of the key questions when you're thinking about license strategy, you're also trying to understand, is the technology a platform technology? So I'll get to it. Platform is when the technology is not just a one solution for one specific disease indication. For the example you shared with us, it was definitely for one specific disease. But there could be new classes of genome editing tools, which could be for multiple diseases. So that's a platform technology. So typically, when John and I get a technology, we work with the investigator to understand the unmet need, the solution that the technology is providing, how to articulate that value proposition, understand which category it fits in, what the path to market looks like, what are the players in that field, what are the companies, and we always consider both options for the technology. So does all that synthesized together make it fit as a good licensing strategy to license to a existing company or to form a startup around it? So let's take an example. I work in regenerative medicine, so it's always easier for me to think of examples that come from that field. So here was an example. So new method of making induced pluripotent stem cells. I think timing plays a big role. If this discovery and this technology, you came to us in 2007, 8, and 9, there weren't many companies working with induced pluripotent stem cells because nobody besides academicians knew how to make iPS cells. It had a lot of promise, but there was not a expertise resident in the pharma companies, etc. So it was actually would lend itself to being a platform, a brand new way of doing something that would apply as a promise to solve so many diseases. So one way was to develop that platform by forming a NewCo that would spend time on technology development, right, and build models where that could first be used as research tools, generate some revenue, pumped back in to understand more and how to apply it as cell therapy or later on. But today, if maybe you had a new method for making iPS cells, the questions I'd ask is it incremental to the existing ways that people make iPS? Is it making it better or being able to do quality check for is that iPS cell a good iPS cell with potential to differentiate into many cell types? And there are many companies that are using iPS cells, so we might license it to one of the companies that might be interested in improving their process and using our technology. And again, this brings up a very important point. You have to think about your licensing strategy as to your partnering it for what application. So you can license iPS cells maybe to more than one company. So that's a non-exclusive licensing strategy. There are 4 or 5 companies making induced pluripotent stem cells. You might license your technology to all of them. Or you might choose to do, with startups very often it's exclusive because they need that for their business value proposition. Also, it can be field limited. Maybe you would license it to a few companies that make research tools. But you would license it exclusively more likely to a company that wants to pursue a therapeutic application for cell therapy. Right? So you could also divide up your partnering licensing strategy by field. So here's another example. Again, so long non-coding RNA. There was a whole new class of gene expression modulators. Right? So when you make that discovery, right, again, classic example of a platform. Is it early stage? Yes. Is it de-risked? No. We don't even know if these will actually translate into being druggable therapeutic targets and how efficacious, how to get the oligos. But again, it's an example of a brand new class of targets. And again, the answer there, because of that, it's probably needs a lot of technology development, value creation, and to form a startup company probably be a more appropriate answer. So the question then you have to ask, so that if that's your licensing strategy you devise, you have to think about, that's your value proposition, that's what you're thinking. And you have to think in terms of how does industry or the partner you want to reach out to view it as an opportunity. You have to think, does this technology fit their pipeline? Does it build out their pipeline? If they've already invested a lot of money and at phase 3 for a similar therapy, unlikely they'd be interested in investing a lot more in your technology or competition for them. So you have to think about, is your value proposition a good opportunity for them? You also want to think about, when you are choosing between licensing partners, does the licensing partner, the commercialization partner, have resources and capabilities required to bring that kind of technology to market? Sometimes it's important to think of the size of the company. If it's truly a platform and you go to a small company, will they be able to leverage the entire capability of the platform? So now let's move to, so how would you move to the next step of tactically getting your partnering started? And this brings us back to, for those of you who did workshop number 1 and 2, that you work closely as an innovator with your technology commercialization office in trying to identify the potential partners and the best approach to reach out to them. And as in the earlier workshops, here is a quick timeline and recap of what happens typically when we file IP and patent applications. You have the provisional patent application. A year later, you do the PCT. 6 months later, it publishes. And at 30 months, you reach national stage. Somewhere in this time is the ideal time to start thinking about reaching out to your commercial partners to market this technology. So like John said, you've articulated your value proposition. We try to write it up as a non-confidential summary that highlights the unmet need, how your technology solves that unmet need, what are the advantages. Then we make a list of potential partners. We've decided our licensing strategy. We make a list of companies that would view this as an opportunity. And typically, we work with you as the investigator because you're in that field to understand if those partners, from your perspective, sound correct, are the ones that you are maybe interfacing with at conferences, etc. You might maybe know specific contacts within that company that would want to champion that science and work in that field. And so this is how you would go about identifying and marketing to potential partners. I want to highlight one thing. So as you are trying to put your technology in, on the path for commercialization, a very common approach is what we call sponsored research agreement or collaboration with industry. So often, as I said, academic technologies are early stage. They're not de-risked, but they have a lot of potential. So sponsored research becomes a good opportunity for both you and the commercialization partner. When they might see the great potential, there might be some intellectual property that as an academic you have filed and is in place. The industry partner would sponsor some research back in the innovator's lab to do some validation research, maybe do more mechanism of action studies, maybe generate more models for the disease. And then typically the industry partner would take an option to license that technology while this research is occurring as it de-risks the technology so that they can license it once there is some more validation work done. The question asked is, what is the mechanism of sponsored research agreements? So sponsored research agreements is just when an industry partner is sponsoring research in the academic lab, right? And often it's a precursor to taking a license. For example, for the example that was here about a mutation in a disease, a company might be interested and might say, but I need to understand a little more. Does it actually work when you make this mutation in the mouse? And they might fund the research because they rather find out the answer before they invest a lot of money and say, this is the technology we're going to spend the next 10 years and $1 billion. Okay. So that brings us to the workshop piece, where we have an example for you for a technology that's methods and devices for sustained release of multiple drugs. So what you're going to do is make a commercialization plan, a strategy. And for that, what you're going to do is, like we did in this workshop, go through what's the unmet clinical need, define it, define what the technology solution is doing to address that unmet need. What's the type of technology, what's the stage of development, and what are, collectively with all this, what are you bringing as a value proposition to the potential partners, and what does the partner need from you, what do you need from the partner to get this technology commercialized?